Hello chess fans, welcome back to Semitier Chess Academy, where today we're going to be covering some of the trickiest but most important moves in chess, which are called the special moves. Now these are legal moves that might surprise newcomers, but mastering them can give your game a huge boost. Now what are special moves? These are moves that break from the usual pattern of piece movement or capture, and the special moves include castling, promoting, and en passant. We're going to start with castling. So what is castling? Castling is the only move in chess where you move two pieces at once, which is the king and the rook. And this move was invented because it was great for safety and development, as castling helps you to take your king to the corner of the board where it is much more safer, and also at the same time activates your rook for a better attack. Here's how it works. The king moves two squares towards a particular rook, either the rook on the king side or the rook on the queen side. Then the rook jumps over and lands just next to the king. Now there are two types of castling, which is firstly the king side castle, also known as the short castling, where you move your king towards the rook that is much more closer to your king side, which is the rook on the h file. Then the queen side castle, where you move your king towards the rook that is on the queen side, which is the rook on the a file. So it's still the same procedure. Now normally some people find it or make mistakes usually when castling queen side. So it's still the same thing. You move your king only two steps, and when your king moves two steps to the left, then your rook stays beside or jumps over and stays beside the king. And if you want to castle king side, it's still the same process. Your king moves only two steps, and when your king has moved two steps, your rook jumps and stays beside the king. And that's how to castle. Now there are some criteria that have to be met before you can castle, and these are firstly, neither the king nor the rook has moved earlier in the game. Now, you can't castle if you have moved your king maybe during the game or your rook also during the game. It only happens when you haven't touched any of this piece within the period of the game till the time that you want to castle. So, now secondly, all the squares between them must be empty. You usually have a knight and bishop, that's for the king side, and for the queen side you have the queen, the knight, and the bishop. So you can't castle with pieces being in between the king and the rook. You must have developed all the pieces to another square, and then if the king and the rook, the spaces between them are empty, then you're free to castle. So that is the only way also you can castle. You can castle when there are pieces between them. Then lastly, you can't castle when your king is on a check. If your king is under attack, you can't castle. You can't castle. Most of my beginner players actually make this mistake. So when your king is on a check, you want to actually run the safety and you'll be like, oh, I can castle, but that's not actually right. You can't castle when your king is on a check. Then secondly, you can't castle when the square between your king and rook, when any of the square between the king and the rook is under attack. You can't castle when any of the square between the king and the rook is under attack. So let's assume there's a queen or there's a rook attacking the f file. So you can't castle king side because the f file, the king has to pass through the f and the g, right? So you can't castle king side because the f file is under attack, and that this doesn't only happen when it's only the queen that's attacking those square. It can be any other piece. It can be a bishop, it can be a queen, it can even be a pawn. So as long as any of the squares that involves your king and rook castling is under attack, you can't castle towards that direction. Now that's all. These are all of the conditions that has to be met before your king can castle. When a pawn reaches the opposite side of the board, for the whites when the pawn reaches the 8th rank, and for black when the pawn reaches the 1st rank, it must be promoted to another piece. And this piece can either be a queen, a rook, a bishop, or knight, not another pawn or king. So you can't promote to another pawn or king, only to the other pieces that are on the board. And lastly, we have the en passant. Now, the en passant is a French word that means in passing. Now, this move lets you capture a pawn that has just moved 2 squares, but only as if it had moved 1. And it's the only capture in which the capturing pawn doesn't land on the captured pawn squares. Now, I know you're used to pawn capturing sideways and also landing on the square that's the pawn that you're capturing is. But in this move, you actually capture not landing on the square that the pawn is, or you just assume that the pawn moved 1 step and then you can capture. And this only happens when your pawn on white is on the 5th rank and your opponent also plays to the 5th rank. And for black, when your pawn is on the 4th rank and your opponent as white also plays to the 4th rank. So that's it for the special moves. See you in our next lesson.